to Mindcrime Liberty Show, released with Milton and him, Tim Pan. Today we discuss who exploits whom. Marx, Hoppe, feminism, and more. Tim.
The question I'd like to answer and have a conversation about here is around these sort of names. Everyone sort of has a common sense definition of exploitation here, which works insofar as it may not have a technical thing. So we sort of get into the technical details of what exactly is and isn't exploitation here. But you name some names in our title. We also include others like Lenin, Carson, Kevin Carson, Gary North, Ricardo Smith, the Maoists, Third Worldists, and Proudhon, of course. So I'll start with Adam Smith, because I think Adam Smith predates a lot of these thinkers. This is the first liberal thinker. And of course, he does have a theory of moral sentiments, but in his book on the wealth of nations, and this Gary North takes this very much so in Why Are We So Rich, he makes the point that the people who are industrious or have ingenuity are the real drivers of the world. And it's a private vice, which is selfishness, which traditional Catholic moral ethical sentiments, as well as sort of left-wing sort of Kantian type ethical systems, pursuing your self-interest in terms of profit. Now, again, of course, Smith has the theory of moral sentiments, and but there is this idea of where private vice equals public virtue. So like hard working for your own ends. This were invisible hand type stuff, and the sort of pro-Smith people who take that there. So I guess you could say those who don't work get exploited. Those who don't work exploit those who do work and work hard and work smart. Now, Proudhon, of course, I think is the next thing worth bringing up here. And Proudhon would just say property is theft. So this is where I think there's an interesting link here, because like the people say that property is a theft, they're absentee landlords and absentee rent collectors. And this is, I'd say, the real tie-in between Smith and Proudhon. And so, like, when the Marxists, we used to do an episode with Chris Catrone, he likes to quote Catrone likes to quote Smith, and a lot of the, Marxist Smithians would say that, like, property, and via Proudhon, it's of course that property, like those property holders are just rent collectors. They're not actually doing anything with their property. They're just sort of sitting around, they're like a aristocratic landlord. They're not, they're idle. So that's one of the ways in which I think is sort of uncanny ways, and I think there's a certain sense that might be true here. Maybe it is true, maybe it isn't the case. And the third group is the ones that take this forward, and that's the Marxists here. The Marxists, of course, think labor time is theft. Effective labor time, or whatever parlance they use. Digging ditches and filling them in is laborious, but that's not necessarily effective labor here. So they'll add a caveat here. But as we stated in other episodes, I think the Marxists fetishize labor here. Now, the Hoppians, of course, they take the state. Hoppians, Rothbardians. I'll start with Hoppians and Rothbardians. There's another theory of exploitation. And they sort of tie back in Proudhonians because they view that the state is the primary exploitator. And I think this is very clear with the sort of left Rothbard and the sort of late Hans Hoppe, who's very critical of the state. Who just views the state, and they sort of do have a tie back with the sort of mutualist anarchists and so forth, because you could think of the state as the biggest landlord. We did an episode on this. So if you really want to try to sort of synthesize the different theories of exploitation, that might be one of the ways to do it. Now, I think there's sort of the Mises, of course, and Hoppe and Rothbard take parts of Mises, but they will say the central banks of the state are the main form of power, and that they, through taxation, it's sort of slavery, it's theft, it creates all these other ripple effects. It devalues the money, and that's the primary way of taxation and control. Like the central banks are the primary form of exploitation here. It's not, and that's also answers why Marx answers a lot of the sort of practical Marxist concerns. And I think there's also broader theories too. Third worldism. Now, I would say third worldism takes the insight of Marxism to universalize it to the end. And you say, well, it's not really working classes in Britain or the United States that are being exploited. If you think really about labor theory, value, exploitation, it's actually the third world that does the labor. That the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Bangladesh, those people. So you get these sort of, and a lot of Marxists don't like these thinkers because it's like, and people brought this to us once up to Milton Friedman. I think Milton Friedman brought this up. Again, I know Milton Friedman has limitations, but I think someone brought this up. They're talking about black slave descendants, and they were trying to argue they were privileged. I think by technical Marxist economics, they are privileged by some technical version. I know a lot of left libertarians don't like to hear that, but that's probably true here, and that's also true for everyone else too. And like the Maoists are big on this, because one of the puzzles for a lot of developed Marxists is why did the revolutions happen in peasant countries, not Germany, not the United States? If anything, in Germany, who had a radical revolution, it was a fascist revolution, not a Marxist revolution. So that's a sort of puzzle to people like Catron and a lot of the developed Marxists here. Now, I think I could answer it, but they do not like the answer, and that's sort of our disagreement, and so forth. And of course, there's the colonial theories of exploitation, which, again, Adam Smith would attack mercantilism, the Corn Laws. Well, Ricardo and others would attack the Corn Laws and various other, bounty systems and so forth. That the cutting down of free trade creates a form of exploitation here. And I guess there's two other theories you could add: feminist theories, which Swithin which is just to say that women get exploited by men. Now, we've done a few episodes on this. I think it's probably the weakest one. I'm not too much interested. If Swithin wants to get into this more, that's more of his thing. And of course, the classic sort of colonial chattel slavery exploitation, which those systems don't really exist. If they do exist, they exist in places like Libya. They exist in places like the former Ottoman Empire. They don't really exist with a capital E. You could argue they're inefficient. There's some people who would make that claim that they're actually technically inefficient, that it's actually better just to pay people. You get more private ingenuity out. We've done a little of the details of that. But overall, if you take a common sense view of exploitation, there's about 7 thinkers here, and 7 theories or so of different forms of exploitation. They range around property. They range around the state. They range around corporate power, whether corporate power is more important than state power. And of course, they range around intellectual power too. Because you could say, like, well, what keeps all these things in place? Maybe it's ideas that keep them in place here. So Swithin, what do you think of the various theories of exploitation here? I do think there's a commonplace things. I think if you dig down deep enough, you look into Adam Smith, you look into Proudhon, you look into Marx, you look into Rothbard, you can find a lot of similarities in between them. And I would say that, the one thing that always haunts the back there is is it the high intelligent or the competent people get exploited by exploit the low competence people here? Maybe that's the real thing that divides the world up between the exploiters and the unexploited here. So maybe that's the one way to synthesize it. What would you make of the different theories of exploitation here? What do you think is the salient or the primary form of exploitation? I will say the state is the primary one. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a right libertarian here. I think banks and finance system, state banks and state finance are the big bugaboos here. I wouldn't be a right libertarian if I wasn't one. What's your take, and what do you think of my overview of different theories? Swithin?
I would possibly unsurprisingly agree with you that the state is one of the is the major root of exploitation, even though it manifests itself in different ways in different times. It might be worth just discussing. I think this might be obvious with respect to what exploitation means here. Exploitations of exploitation theory from sort of Marxism would be, how does someone live at the expense of somebody else? In a way, there's an idea that there are some. It's generally an economic concept, and that there's either certain groups can't earn as much as they otherwise would, or the stuff that they do earn is taken from them by another group. That would seem to me to be a rough and ready but reasonably useful way of looking at exploitation. To mention, you mentioned sort of feminism. Feminism seems to be. We were just going through all the different types we think of, and I thought, we could mention feminism. But as you say, I have very little truck with the feminists. It seems to make very little sense, considering, well, if you take the sort of quote unquote the traditional model, although that isn't necessary to what I think I'm going to call it traditional. If anything, the wife exploits the husband because the husband is the one who's actually bringing in sort of monetary income. Now, of course, the feminists will go, well, there's unpaid labor in the household and stuff. Fine. But if you're looking at pure sort of economic terms, the husband is bringing home the bacon in such a model. And also, it just seems highly unlikely that there would be a systematic exploitation between the sexes when they're so obviously complementary. Now, that's not to say that any individual level of exploitation couldn't take place, but rather that it would exist on such a wide scale is just absurd. To your point on the state, I would say the state is the major one, although in a way you could say it's more fundamental than the state in that, well, actually, I'll circle back. What I think is consistent, say, between the Marxists, the Rothbardians, the Proudhonists, the third worldists as well to a large extent. Not to sound like a Georgist, but I think a lot of the sort of root of exploitation seems to come down to land. And that's what Proudhon was concerned mostly about, was sort of absentee landlords, in that somehow a certain group could arrogate themselves a certain piece of land and exclude others from working on it. I mean, that's why, for instance, in Marxism, you get the proletariat are landless. Well, why are they landless? Well, at least in sort of British terms, because they've been booted off the common land and they can't till it themselves anymore, so they have to be employed. As it were, self-employment, it's not impossible, but it's significantly less possible than it was where you could work for the Lord for a little bit, pay your tithes and your duties and stuff, but then there's also common land that you can work on. Kevin Carson has some interesting historical analysis in this regard. So I think a lot of the time, so what I'm saying is this, depending, of course, on how you want to define the state, I think it's possible that a society might have property norms in which if someone just verbally claimed a certain piece of land, and if they were of sufficient rank in the society, now you could call that just statist if you wished. But the reason I focus on land is because it does give a lot of if you can completely exclude people from it, I mean, access to sort of like productively useful resources is a lot lower, and I suppose you could argue it's more of a thing prior to the Industrial Revolution, but it's still obviously true today. I mean, you just look at rental prices in most cities, and it's pretty obvious that if you have sort of single ownership of land, I mean, you can earn a serious amount of money in rental income. Now, I'm not saying that's per se exploitative, but it shows that land still matters in that way. But as I've implied, in the case of England and Britain, the rise of the state and land expropriation go hand in hand with the enclosures, etc., with the sort of rise of the more sort of bureaucratic state. And well, interestingly, under Henry VIII, I mean, Henry VIII wanted to get over and above. Well, he wanted to reduce the power of the nobility by allying himself with the merchant class, and I think from memory, he was the first guy to introduce the Enclosures Acts, and so that the merchants could more easily graze sheep because the wool industry was very lucrative at the time. So I would certainly go on the state. Now, with respect to the competent and the incompetent, I mean, it almost answers itself when you put it in that way. I mean, how could the incompetent exploit the competent? I mean, in a way, unless there was some sort of street savvy amongst the sort of intellectually undeveloped, shall we call them, to be able to somehow exploit the rich. Unless of course they could somehow successfully impose some sort of quote unquote slave morality, which I suppose could be sort of like a Nietzschean version, which I think about sort of exploitation in that sense. But it just seems obvious that it would be the competent which is exploit the incompetent, which doesn't mean that the incompetent can't help. If you've got a particular competent demagogic figure who can sort of use the generally incompetent to aid his goals in certain ways, then you could argue to some extent the incompetent were exploiting the competent. But without some very sort of competent or small group of people who are competent to organize them, I simply don't see them ever getting to a situation where they could exploit the competent. So that would be sort of my general overview of the way I would approach this.
One of the ways which I think you can link Gary North's, and he takes this Why Are We So Rich, and Adam Smith, the Bredonians, and the Marxists all together. And Gary North was our sort of stand-in for, the Rothbardians too, is that like if you take the private industriousness and you try, why would you be privately industrious if you did not have access to the capital and the means of the good, like the means of production and to the actual gains? So like, if you take it like the existential comics type guy, the others, they really go after capital and land as like, well, even if you take the sort of Protestant Weberian Gary North type, Adam Smith type morality seriously, many of the workers don't even have access to that. They're just paying rents. Now, this gets into the nation who's actually doing the renting, who's actually the absentee landlord. We did this in our Is the State a Landlord episode here. And, my problem with sort of the left anarchists, the left generally, but not necessarily the left anarchists. The left anarchists know this, but the left generally don't really see that the state is the actual landlord. It's not. It's the landlord. The private landlords are more, either short-term businessmen who just see a gain to be made, or they're actually technically unethical, which is like, okay, it's fine, it's unethical to do that, but then why are they allowed to do that, and why isn't there why is there continuing to allowed to do that? You could always go to they're more competent than the others, but you have to sort of ask that question here. So like maybe that's the reason, is that people don't have access to means of production. So maybe the Marxists are right. Maybe this, if you want to steel man them here. But one question I've always had is, and I think this is related to other things too, and I think this should be asked with libertarians as well, is why hasn't there been more revolutions? Why hasn't there been more slave rebellions? Why hasn't there been more like tax rebellions and so forth here? You could ask, why are people so docile too? Whatever your theory of exploitation here, and I think you touched on that a little bit at the end here of your most recent comment here. And again, if you think wage slavery is slavery, which I think the Kevin Carsonians and the Keith Prestons of the world do, why do so many people work for McDonald's here? Why don't they sort of overthrow the bosses, so to speak, since the bosses are few, the workers and masses are many here? And that's question, that question of exploitation here, you either have to say they don't actually believe they're being exploited, or they believe they're being exploited in a sense, but they have no alternative, or they believe that the exploitation is actually good, and therefore they're not really being exploited. So you're left with, to me, basically three options here, because if they really are exploitative, then why are there so few revolutions to overthrow this form of exploitation here? Are the sheeple don't know what they're good for? Are the sheeple, so to speak, too dumb? Are the sheeple too disorganized here? And if they need to be organized, who exactly is going to do the organizing here? So Swithin, what do you make of my sort of quick 1-2 response here? I do think there is a way you can link Gary North's "Why Are You So Rich," which giving productive labor at private ingenuity. Why would you want to be? I could see why. Thaddeus Russell talks about how, and again, sometimes Thaddeus Russell gets picked up by Thaddeus Russell gets annoyed when he gets picked up by certain far right people, because I'm using that technically, because he'll say that the slaves were lazy, but Thaddeus Russell will make the point that slaves are lazy, but it's rational to be lazy. They don't get paid. In the same way with serfs, they don't get paid to be not lazy here. I think if anyone goes to a small business that's locally owned by you might get very good service. If you go to a McDonald's, you're going to get average service. You're not going to get great service. You're not going to get bad service. I think that's sort of quick example here. But of course, the Randians would say, well, maybe the small business owner exploits everybody gets exploited by everybody else. There's always a sort of counter pushback here. But I've asked a number of points here, because I don't have a coherent theory of exploitation. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing the episode. If I had a coherent theory, I'd just lay it out and say this is what I think here. But I do see exploitation going both ways here, and I do. But I want to go back to the confidence. But what's your take on that, Swithin? Why haven't there been more overthrowing, if indeed it is happening?
I think one of the main reasons why there hasn't been as many is revolutions are risky. Even if you were to take the position that yes, we're being exploited, yes, systematically, the question is, well, is it worth rolling the dice to try to replace the ruling class with something else? Or should we just go, well, let's just try to make the best of it? And then you get into the sort of reformist versus revolutionaries. So you could argue that, say, the social democratic parties or the social democratic views of sort of the late 19th century, they see, the excesses and the exploitation of the capitalist class. What should we do? Should we become Marxist revolutionaries or should we become trade unionists? Shall we just organize them and try to keep the system alive, because we can kind of see there's good there, and it always kind of balance it out. So I think as ever you've got the idea that maybe reformist approach would be quite good. There's also the idea of sort of the ideology of the society. It might be the case that, well, if they think about it and you ask them, are you exploited by your lord? Well, yeah, kind of, but he's the lord, so he's allowed to. Now, I suppose you could argue that in that sense, they don't think it's exploitation. But I mean, in practice, I don't know if that makes that much difference. They just go, well, actually, no, he's the lord. This is what the lord does, and he provides stuff for us. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'd never been invaded. The last 4 wars, but he might, so he might be worthwhile. So there's that, and then of course there's the degree to which you think you're being exploited. Because if you've been exploited but only a small amount, then again, the costs of revolution are too high. Talking about slaves, you could argue slaves are highly exploited, which is true in many cases. But is it really going to be in their interest to try and overthrow their master? It's going to depend on the social circumstances, to what extent they think they can free themselves or go somewhere else, and what can they earn. It might be a better tactic just to try and work well for their master, so he treats them relatively well. Historically, there were slaves who were given their freedom by their masters and their will because they seemed to be a good slave. Given the fact that they were going to be given their freedom in the death, I think it unlikely, at least comparative to other slaves at the time, that they would have been treated that badly. So in a way, I think you could argue if the super competent ruling class, what they need to do is to sort of exploit people enough so they get enough economic benefit out of it and get extra power without turning the dial too high to make it worthwhile to rebel. I think if I were sort of, if I was in a position of sort of exploitative ruling class, that's what I would do. Or at least that's what I think I would do anyway. Now, as to why the Marxist revolutions took place in agrarian societies and not sort of more advanced societies, I think possibly to some extent that the agrarian ones kind of thought that they had less to lose, especially if they're agrarian farmers and they could just keep farming but hope get rid of a lord. That's kind of, they can continue as they were, hopefully, without some sort of guy taking some of their stuff. But when you've got a situation where you've got to sort of own and run factories and stuff, you might not be hugely competent to do so, and the whole system might kind of collapse in a way. Whereas in the agrarian societies, it's kind of simpler to be relatively self-sufficient, which I think would then reduce the probability. Reduce the costs of a revolution, and so make it more likely. So that would be my approach to why it would happen to various places.
What do you reckon with And we did an episode on Kevin Carson, and one of the points I've made is that Kevin Carson seems like a proto-primitivist. And I'd say the best primitivist out there, if there is indeed one, is Ted Kaczynski here. Could you just say that industrial society is exploitative here, and that having sort of wide-ranging division of labor, where you don't know which part of the production process. Like if you're making a cabinet, you chop down the tree, you make the whole cabinet yourself, or the log cabin yourself. You have the whole production process in front of you. You have all the goods in front of you. But if, on the other hand, if you're going to a hardware store, they're probably getting their lithium from some factory in Nigeria, and they're getting this from some place in London, and this finance from someplace else. Blah blah blah. That's somewhat alienated. So my critique of like Carson would be that he's just a kind of primitivist, which is fine. I live within I can go drive a half an hour and see a huge population of Mennonites and Amish. I'd say they're some of the best proto-primitivists. Yes, some of them use iPhones. Yes, some of them have sneakily used technology on the side. But if gas, they're not, people who use horse and buggies aren't directly affected by gasoline prices, for example. Here, they're relatively easier to maintain here. Now, of course, the state makes vehicles harder to maintain. Blah blah blah. So that's sort of counterback to Carson here. Maybe it's state industrial society that's exploitive. It's not industrialism itself. It's state industrial society. Maybe there's never. But then again, they would say, well, maybe you could have had the Industrial Revolution without the state here. So maybe that's the question here. What would you make about, like industrial society? Because maybe that's the thing that's actually Smith is driving at, like the division of labor. If you can all specialize. This definitely Ricardo makes this point. If you can specialize, if you get really good at fishing, you start thinking, well, actually, if I take a boat out there made of steel, and then I just go, that's actually the best way to fish. Forget, being just a skilled craftsman here, and so forth. But what would you make about that? Is industrial society itself exploitative? Maybe we're all just missing the mark here in that sense. All the thinkers I listed here, and we need to go in that way. Swithin?
That's a very interesting point. Ted Kaczynski, one of the reasons Kaczynski argues against the industrial society, because he thinks basically my position is impossible, which is in the technological society in which there isn't sort of a central bureaucracy of high level regulation and high levels of sort of like a genuine sort of free market industrial society, he basically thinks can't happen. But the interesting question I think here is, though, even if it were to happen, it is true that you can't be self-sufficient in a certain way. Now, I suppose this does depend to what extent, how long supply chains would be absent sort of Hat-Tip, Peter Zion and Todd Lewis, the US Navy's patrol of the shipping lanes worldwide. But even so, you're going to be dependent upon resources from somewhere other than something very, very, very local, probably. Otherwise, you're not going to have the materials to produce the stuff you want to produce. For things like lithium, for instance. This is even the case if you had the situation whereby everybody had their own micro nuclear reactor, so they could have all the electricity they possibly want, and just need to buy thorium on a sort of infrequent basis because that thorium's so energy dense that you basically never have to buy it once. Either way, you're still going to be dependent on other people from a large distance away from you. You could argue, well, whether that's really exploitation is another question. But if you were to treat it as sort of exploitation of freedom or something like that, then you could argue that, well then yes, industrial society is going to make you dependent on other people in a way that you don't have in a pre-industrial society. And also, you could say that the reason it seems exploitative in the industrial society is it's kind of this faceless group of people who have this sort of control over you with access to the resources and what resources go where. Whereas in a pre-industrial society, you kind of know. I remember Todd Lewis making this kind of claim. You kind of got like a human scale society, but still, even then, in a pre-industrial society, you still got merchants. I mean, you had like the Silk Road and stuff. But yes, you could say if you expanded it beyond sort of like a more of an economic one for a sense of sort of like freedom as such, then yeah, yes, you could definitely say industrial society is exploitative. Marx doesn't, because Marx is a materialist and just and seems to value technology, which is where sort of like the modern sort of eco-Marxists aren't really Marxists, because Marx was all about material progression and increasing man's power over nature to sort of meld it in his own image. So, yeah, I think your point on the industrial society is an interesting one.
And actual existing Marxist societies, whether they are true Marxist societies or not, are terrible to the environment, for better or for worse. I think it's quite rational that, like, if you view the United States as threatening you, so you need to quickly build nuclear weapons, or you're going to poison a lake somewhere in Siberia, or it's in the Balkans, just say, okay, I need to test some weapons here. Let's quickly get this done here. I think, or so actual existing Marxist regimes are quite bad for the environment anyway, which is fine. Again, I think to go back to, I think Alex, the carousel of Epstein's. Some of them are great, some of them are terrible. The guy who wrote the moral case for fossil fuel here, I very much agree with that take here. So that the eco-Marxists, in a sense, should just be primitives here. And Cadron would make the point that he doesn't like the David Graeber left anarchist view. He says that it's sort of like a fairy tale here, that you need technology, So David Graeber, in a sense, gets into he's sort of the left wing version of what you and I are, to some extent here. So why do I think this is important to lay out the theories of the exploitation, and why I think they all sort of matter here? I think the common sense definition of exploitation makes proximate sense. Contrary to what maybe Keith Preston thinks, contrary to what Kevin Carson may thinks, I do think the logic of Adam Smith do go after certain absentee landlords. The problem is, do the landlords serve a purpose here? And we sort of discussed this. Do the renter class serve an interest here? And who puts them in power here? So now Kevin Carson and Keith Preston have better answers to that question here. If it indeed is exploitative here, if indeed it is things that you wouldn't freely negotiate in an actual quote-unquote freed market here, you wouldn't take a 20% interest rate here. But you might not get much interest at all. That's another thing here. Maybe loans just wouldn't really exist of monetary goods in society for monetary goods or something like that. Getting the technical terms, which are more my weak point here. So that'd be my sort of criticisms, and then the state itself. The best argument for the state, and this is the only argument for the state to me, and it's the one that, when pushed, people will make here, including Todd Lewis, including Moldbug, including Mises, is the state protects you from other states here. So, if you want, even the United States here, they always have the China boogeyman or the Russia boogeyman to deploy, and they'll deploy them against different people. And again, Putin will deploy the Western boogeyman against certain people. And in the previous times, would you want to be exploited by those landlords from France, or those landlords from the Norman conquerors, or whatever, or the Scottish landlords? And so you can do this for other things here. So I'd say even Marxist regimes are bent on the idea that they protect you from capitalist regimes, the actual existing ones. The North Korean regime protects you from the South Korean regime. And in a sense, it's true. In a sense, if the Kims fell today, they would probably be occupied by either China or the United States. The national defense thing does make sense here, but it's also a problem for the left-wing people. And I've just sort of discussed this with like the Spanish Revolution here. The Spanish Revolution was taken over by the Stalinists, hijacked by the Stalinists first. They actually split the camps, as Orwell would point out, if I recall correctly. So, like, if you have a trade unionist society or Kevin Carsonianist society here, and some big bad, I don't know, Stalinistan, or I don't know, some big bad, Gary Northville comes in. Not that Gary Northville, maybe they would come in. How do you defend yourself against those people? So maybe you can internally set it up amongst people, but you need to defend it here. So that's, to me, the only argument for the state and all its sort of overarching tentacles here. Our corporations protect us from other corporations here. What do you make of that argument for the state? The state sort of writ large here. I'm taking the sort of thick definition of the state used by Kevin Carson and Keith Preston and a lot of the mutualists here. I'm not just saying, yes, Elon Musk gets a lot of state power, so therefore he's probably, in some sense, statist in some way. So yes, I'm using a very thick way. What do you make of that claim? And then just sort of boil it back down to the micro level. If you have a society which is exploitation free, how do you keep outside exploiters away? The Nietzschean claims you become, in fighting monsters, be careful not to become one. Rothbard has a history of the United States here, and Rothbard seemed to think that at some point the United States was quite entirely free, had quite, maybe just at the frontier, so maybe the primitives angle comes back in, that, freedom is really only found in, like, the not-so-wild West, and so forth, or in sort of areas away from, quote-unquote parasitic classes, and so forth, that aren't firmly entrenched. What do you make of that, Swithin?
I think that the argument that the state is there to protect other states merely just seems to be a species of, well, we need the state, otherwise there would be a lawlessness, which I don't really buy.
Quick interruption. Do you think that is the argument that is deployed as the sort of cornerstone of, or do you think it's something else?
I think if you get down to drilling people as to why they think you need a state, is not for crime per se, but like a large organized group of bad men who are going to come and take and beat you up, take stuff from you and beat you up, and therefore we need to protect it from them. So I think in most cases, yes, I think you're right. It does devolve to the national defense type argument. I mean, you could argue it might be fair, it might be a good argument to some extent, but I mean, I tend to find these people to overestimate the amount of external exploitation or potential exploitation, and underestimate the amount of internal exploitation in their sort of way of doing things. So, for instance, apologists for the American empire will go, oh, how bad the Chinese are, how bad the Russians are, and be completely two-faced and blind to when the Americans do exactly the same things that they are accusing the Chinese or the Russians of doing. Oh no, they put political prisoners away and make them disappear. It's like, have you heard of Julian Assange? At which point, oh no, he's terrible. He broke the law. So I think that's an argument often deployed. I don't think it's a very good argument, because all you need, I think, in general, to prevent an invasion, one is to have a very armed population anyway, so that the costs of occupation are very high, so it dissuades entry. And also communication technology. Alexander the Great would not have been able to have got the empire he did if all those cities that he conquered could actually coordinate their armies and work together and have like a big showdown with him early on. He wouldn't have got past. Then the question arises, well, would you have modern communication technology without the state? Would you have private satellites that did that? I don't know. I certainly could see in such a situation there'd be a lot of motivation to do that, because if you did have satellites which were there, and so you could get sort of reliable communication, then that'd be highly valuable. So I'd expect it would happen. Although, maybe you could argue the economies of scale don't work on such a small level or whatever. You could do that, but I think that'd be a more interesting claim. But the national defense argument is, I think once you look at it closely and look at the reasons why people invade other places, it's nowhere near as strong as it seems on the surface.
It's nowhere near as strong. I agree, but I do think I do think on a visceral level that why don't people? Because in a sense, a trade union, if you take thicker versions of if you take a sort of autistic version of states, seriously, you start coming into theories of like, well, is the family a state? Is the trade union a state? Is McDonald's a state? Well, maybe not here. So this comes back into the old age of the question: what is the state here? And what is the ruling class here? But if you think, why don't you overthrow your workers? Because the Marxists view the state as like a worker state. They want a worker state, and a lot of the Burnham people, the managerial revolution people, the sort of competence theorists, which is a bit of a dog whistle here, would just view a worker state as a contradiction in terms here, because you need a sort of like the iron law of oligarchy here, so forth. Maybe it's just impossible here to have that thing. And again, that's one reason I'm a right libertarian. I think some forms of exploitation are just going to happen because people acting out their own freedom make bad choices or make uninformed choices, and there's no benevolent dictators around to inform them of what their actual good choice would be here. So that's my own view on exploitation here. That people talk about consciousness and raising consciousness. I do think, on some level, even though that's a bit of a meme, that's a bit of a stupid word. I do think on some level it is true insofar as you have to make people aware of taxation is, if anyone else would engage in taxation, they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't, if a private citizen, so to speak, if such things exist, do it. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. But people just accept it. So I do think there needs to be progress on freedom in that sense, but there might be an upper limit here unto what exactly everyone wants to do and has the ability or the willingness to do as well. So that will be my overall thing on exploitation here. I think exploitation is fairly common, but whether it's conscious or not is a good question here. And if in some sense, if it's not conscious, who really even cares? Who even Ted Kaczynski, is Kaczynski better off now? He's living in some supermax prison here. And actually, a Netflix documentary on him would say that one thing he's afraid of is actually him growing to like the prison here. I mean, because it's in a bizarre sense that I think he gets to write all his letters and so forth. So I don't know. In the exploitation theories, I think are very useful here, and I think there's a lot of overlap between the Marxists and libertarians, which is this is a sort of follow-up of our most recent episode on why Sean Gabb and Chris Crotone agree so much. Because I think if you boil down certain theories and you take good definition and uses of society and the data, you can get similar conclusions. So then, do you have any final comments here on maybe there's an upper bound to an exploitation-free society? Aren't bad choices just going to be made, or differences in views? What's your view? Thanks for doing this episode here. That's probably my last comment here.
I think the iron law of oligarchy is true, but I don't necessarily think all oligarchies are necessarily exploitative in the relevant sense. But even if they were, I think this, at least on a political level, is a reason why you want many, many political communities, so it's very easy to move between them. Even in, for example, in Britain, even in the medieval period, you could be relatively mobile. Some of them some of them were tied to the land, but not everybody. But as far as you were, you could move. And if you could move to a different political community, that allows people to influence the area in which they they live and the way it's run without having to run it themselves, because they themselves won't be very competent at running it. I mean, so for instance, it's like, well, a good pizzeria will exist because people go and buy stuff from them. That doesn't mean that the customers have any idea how to run or make decent pizza. But insofar as they know that they can go to different ones, it's then likely to increase the quality of the pizzeria, as opposed to only being able to go to one single pizzeria in like a massive sort of say entirely in America. I mean, there's only one pizzeria. So that would be one thing. I would also say, I think at the heart, to some extent, with the exploitation theory is the view that if there were not exploitation, there would be income equality, which simply just isn't true. I mean, we were talking about the competency theory. I mean, you're always going to have people who are better than others, they're more intelligent, they're going to earn more. They're just going to make better on average decisions and be able to satisfy a group of consumers better than any of them individually could do. And so their monetary income is going to be significantly higher. I mean, that's going to happen. Is that exploitative? Not necessarily. But I think one thing we have to think with exploitation is the idea that somehow you would expect high levels of income equality. I think Kevin Carson does this as well. He kind of thinks that in the free market somehow it would all be flattened out, which I just think is not how reality works. I suppose in a way you could argue that sort of like pan-anarchism of the Prestonian variety is a way of being able to choose your slave master for most people. It's, okay, where do I choose to live under, rather than running anything. Now, the slave master will know they can't be sold, whatever. But you get the idea. Then a lot of people are never going to be in the situation of actually running anything, because they're just not competent to do so, and they have no interest in doing so either. Why some people just simply don't want to work up the corporate ladder because it requires them working more hours. They'd rather go home earlier. And so, in a way, I think that, well, I suppose insofar, I mean, Taylor says something like this. Basically being an employee is like being like a slave of some description, because you basically just do whatever your boss tells you within reason. So it's almost like a form of voluntary slave contract. Now, obviously, it's not in perpetuity, et cetera, but you get the idea. So I think, again, with exploitation, you've got to take into account sort of the equality and inequality thing. I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.